Welcome to The Kingstonian, a podcast that profiles people who are passionate about what they do for a living, what organization they belong to, or the community they are a part of. Here is your host, Dave Cunningham.
Thank you, Steve. Hello, everyone, and welcome. U.S. politics has been dominating headlines in recent weeks with no shortage of analysis, debates, and breaking news. To help us make sense of the latest developments south of the border, I'm joined by Paul Gardner, Assistant Professor of Political Studies at Queen's University here in Kingston, Ontario. Paul's research spans institutions like Queen's and the Maxwell School at Syracuse University, and he earned his Ph.D. from the Department of Politics at Princeton University. His expertise lies in American law and politics. In this episode, we discuss a wide range of pressing topics, including the U.S. Supreme Court, Donald Trump, tariffs, and more. Given the fast-moving nature of these issues, for your information, this conversation was recorded on February 3rd, 2025. Paul, welcome to the podcast, and thanks very much for your time.
Oh, thanks for having me on the podcast.
Here we are, recording this episode in early February 2025, trying to make sense of all of the political news coming out of the U.S. since Inauguration Day 2 weeks ago. And I have many questions, and I hope that by the end of this conversation, we will all have a better understanding of what's going on, hopefully anyway.
And I hope so too. I have a lot of questions as well, so we'll see which ones we can get to together.
See how many of your questions are the same as mine. But let's back up a little bit and find out a little bit about you. When did the study of American law and politics become your focus?
I think I became interested in law and politics, as early as elementary school. I remember reading a fifth grade U.S. history textbook and just being sort of enthralled with it. It's not often that you read a textbook cover to cover, but in this case I did. And then as I got deeper into high school and university, I think the reason why I focused on U.S. courts was largely because I viewed them as having a great potential to move progressive causes forward. I saw it sort of as an institution that was concerned with justice and could promote the best of humanity in some ways. Grad school really beat that notion out of me and sort of learned about all the downsides of courts. But that's really what drove me to become interested in the first place, is thinking about politics as a forum of the improvement of politics and society.
Let's get back to some of the questions that I am not sure where to start with these when I was trying to put together something, but I thought that having read some of the information that you have online about you and what you're studying and researching, the phrase private enforcement statutes came up. I think I know what that is, but I'm not sure. And your study concerns those and how politics has shaped them. And I'm wondering if you can, in a simple kind of way, explain what your point of view is on that.
Yeah, so I guess we can start with some recent current events, right? So prior to the overturning of Roe v. Wade and the Dobbs v. Jackson women's health decision, a lot of states were looking for ways that they might limit access to abortion. And one of the ways that Texas came up with is that the state wasn't going to limit access to abortion. Instead, what they were going to do is they were going to allow individuals, other citizens, to basically tattletale on people that they thought had administered or received abortions, and then to bring a civil action in court that would result in some sort of monetary damages. So there, it wasn't the state making something criminal. It was the state allowing for individuals to bring civil actions against others for a particular purpose, in this case, in an effort to make it more difficult or scary for people to obtain abortions.
So just if I can jump in and ask a question on that point. So if there were civil actions that they were encouraging people to bring forward, where would the money generated by those civil actions go?
So generally, and this is what we mean when we talk about private enforcement statutes, is that we're creating the opportunity for individuals to bring these civil actions. And typically under these civil actions, the money is kept by the individual that brings the lawsuit. And so these private enforcement statutes are a mechanism to try to create disincentives for certain activities. The other major area that this has been regularly used in the United States is for employment discrimination, where individuals don't actually go to a bureaucratic organization in order to get an order, like for the bureaucracy to tell a private business, you are engaged in discrimination and you can't do that. While there is such a bureaucratic organization in the United States, it's relatively toothless. It can't actually stop businesses from engaging in discrimination and make them adopt different policies. And so instead, what the statute does is it gives the right for somebody who's experienced discrimination to bring a lawsuit against their employer in order to get back wages. And then they add things on like triple damages or attorney's fees to make it easier for people to bring those kinds of lawsuits. And so it sort of, depending on what the goals of the statute are, it may make more or less sense for those damages to go to the individual who brings the case. We might think it sounds quite fair for the victim of employment discrimination to be able to sue for back wages and maybe even obtain triple damages. But this mechanism has been expanded to a lot of other areas, and the use of these private actions in Texas for the purpose of limiting abortion was a relatively new and creative use. And it raises issues of sort of fairness around, like, is that actually where, do we think that monetary damages are the way to go? And does it create a sort of moral hazard for people to bring actions where maybe they otherwise shouldn't?
Now, if we leapfrog a little bit to the general approach that the U.S. has had with respect to governance, and that's there are three branches. There's the executive, the legislative, and the judicial. So if we follow your argument about these lawsuits, does that mean that the judicial becomes far more critical to the whole business of managing the government?
I think that's right. And that's generally been the understanding of U.S. politics for quite a bit, right? Is that there's large amounts of literature trying to understand why courts are so powerful in the United States and compared with other countries. The U.S. Supreme Court is typically considered the most powerful court in the world. And that's not just on the basis of its ability to make constitutional decisions, but because so many different kinds of disputes end up adjudicated in courts where they might not be in other countries, right? That bureaucratic decision-making is often reviewed by courts at a sort of higher clip than it might be in Canada or other sorts of parliamentary democracies. And there are lots of reasons for that. Some of it is about the institutional openness of courts, which can be a really great thing, right? Because it gives people who otherwise don't have access to politics and government a way to have their claims heard. But it also means that it's a greater opportunity for courts to expand their jurisdictions. And I think you're exactly right that sort of it makes courts a more important forum of politics.
My impression, and I guess I could be wrong on this, is that the Supreme Court specifically, I thought would be more even-handed in its approach. But in my mind, if you follow the news, it seems to be as political as every other institution in the States. Fair statement?
So it certainly depends who you're asking, right? So I think a lot of conservatives on the court today would say that they're bringing the court back to the institution that it should have been all along, and that it was a history of the Warren Court and the Burger Courts in the 60s and 70s that had taken the court to a place that it was never intended to go. But I think that opens up a larger question, whether the current court is one that we think is making the right kinds of decisions. I think we instead have to think about what the incentives are for a court to be more political. A moment ago, we were talking about courts in the United States as an important area of political contestation. And there were lots of reasons why courts have developed as this forum of political contestation. And part of it comes from the fact that courts can resolve problems for legislatures and executives. It can be a way to get past congressional gridlock, right? So if Congress can't get things done because parties can't agree, the court can maybe push through that gridlock. Or if you have to include an unconstitutional provision in a bill in order to get the bill through Congress, then the court can strip that out. There's actually an example of this that I like to use during the Clinton administration, where the Clinton administration was just trying to modernize airwaves, right? We have the internet, we have cable television, and they're trying to change these statutes that are just dealing with like over-the-air broadcasting. But in order to get this done, one senator from Nebraska, Jim Exon, says, we need to make it illegal for there to be basically broadcasts of pornography, or like we need to include sort of protections against pornography in this law. And everybody thought that this was unconstitutional, that it was a violation of freedom of the press under the First Amendment, including Clinton and most members of Congress. But they let him have it. And then the Supreme Court comes in and strips it out and solves this political problem. And so the court gains power through things like this, right? That the other branches of government are willing to defer to the Supreme Court because of the problems that it solves. But when you allow the court to be more active in judicial review, stripping out bits of statutes, it becomes even more important what the court is doing. And so then presidents and senators who confirm Supreme Court appointees become much more attentive to the kinds of people that they're putting in office, because they see major decisions like Brown versus Board of Education, which results in desegregation, and Roe v. Wade, which enshrines a constitutional right to abortion. And they say, well, these big political decisions are being made, so we need to pay attention to this, and we need to make sure that we get our guys in office, that we get our guys on the court, so that they're going to make the kinds of decisions we want them to make. So as you have more and more decisions that become more importantly political, it ups the stakes so that, and it creates a sort of feedback cycle of more and more politics getting onto the court.
How do you view the court's view on presidential immunity, which a lot of people are concerned about?
For me, it's a concerning decision, right? It's certainly expanding the power of the presidency in a significant way. And it's taking away potentially important limits on presidential power. At the same time, the court didn't necessarily open the door to any sort of criminal activity. And the fact that Donald Trump was reelected means that we're not going to be allowed to sort of reinterrogate some of what happened, right? The dismissal or the withdrawal of the Jack Smith special counsel cases mean that we don't actually get to see sort of what level of presidential conduct is actually immune. Because the court said, well, if it's part of your official conduct or related to your official conduct, then it generally can't be prosecuted. But a big question that was left unanswered is, were things like the January 6th insurrection part of a president's official duties? And the Smith counsel, the special counsel, had prepared plenty of argumentation saying this had nothing to do with the president's official duties. But without those cases going forward, we're unlikely to allow the Supreme Court a chance to clarify, well, how far does that immunity really go?
Speaking of that particular episode, in January of 2021, the U.S. Capitol was breached. Hundreds were arrested, tried, and sentenced for various crimes. Fast forward 4 years, and all were granted full pardons. Do you have a sense as to how the public at large views that particular decision in light of the fact that some of these charges were pretty serious?
My sense of how the public views it is that it's quite polarized, right? That people's views on that particular issue are largely correlated with their opinion of Donald Trump as a president. It goes along with an increasing theme of American politics over the past 20 or 30 years, that there tends to be this division that rather than our opinions about issues informing who we support as candidates, more and more it seems to be who we support as candidates determining what we think about issues. And this seems to be one of those. I mean, from my own personal perspective, right, what does it do to have those sorts of pardons? Well, it tells you that you can engage in illegal and dangerous actions as long as you have the support of someone in a politically high office. That's definitely problematic. But I think that the responses to that sort of decision are conditioned on what people think about Donald Trump, unfortunately.
Speaking of Donald Trump, can you give us any sense as to why he has such control over his party, over the folks who vote for him? What is it about him?
So I can only sort of like wildly speculate, which I'm more than happy to do. There's been a lot of talk about economic insecurities, racial insecurities, people feeling as though the United States is not a place where people like them can get ahead anymore. And Donald Trump effectively plays into some of those ideas, right? Scapegoating immigrants and people from other backgrounds, painting people from certain racial groups as criminals. And it feeds into a politics of grievance, and that politics of grievance is attractive to the extent that it gives people a story for why it feels hard to live right now. And Donald Trump has a particular success, I think, in moving that sort of story forward because he seems to be untethered from traditional norms of politics. And while a lot of us look at that and say, well, that's the problem, right? He's not respectful of institutions and the way things have been done. That's what a lot of people like. They're saying, look, this is a rich guy. He's not beholden to other sorts of interests. He's his own man. And look, he speaks frankly, he tells it like it is. He doesn't seem like he's filtering things. And that's somebody that I want to throw my support behind. But ultimately, I think it's difficult to understand for me why his particular brand has broken through where others haven't.
There are a whole bunch of issues that have been getting thrown at us over the past several months, and they become more important with his election as president. And I'd like to run through a few and see if I can get your opinion on some of them. Let's start with social media moguls who are spending a lot of time in the White House, in particular Elon Musk. Before we started recording, I heard something in one of the feeds online about him going into a particular agency of the government in the States today or last night and getting access to all sorts of material that he shouldn't probably be getting access to because I don't know if he has any security clearance or not. But my understanding was that he was supposed to be coming up with ways to cut back on spending. Do you see any danger in the way he's been given free rein on this?
Yeah, well, listen, this is why we normally have appointments by the president, which are only confirmed with the advice and consent of the Senate.
Yeah.
Right, that we don't just give the president unilateral power to appoint whoever he wants to the highest offices. And so, yeah, it's concerning both in the respect of like what is the substance of the actions that Musk is taking as the head of this government accountability office or whatever we're calling it, but also just the fact of like, is this the person that we want doing this? And this is somebody who's unelected, apparently not particularly responsible to anyone, including the American people. With the Donald Trump is famously mercurial, and we've seen different advisors come in and out depending on his whims. And so how long he'll stay around is certainly a question. But yeah, it's hard to even understand exactly what the meat of these policies are, what his portfolio is, what sort of information he's been given access to in the Treasury Department. But these things aren't supposed to happen, right? Congress has built into various statutes in the creation of various agencies, things like inspectors general, things like requirements for reporting to Congress, oversight. And this creation of this new office with no oversight is intentionally to get around some of this. And I mean, I wouldn't expect that necessarily these sorts of things will get free rein in the courts, right? That the courts may review some of this behavior and find that it was illegal, but the damage could already be done.
The other issue that is top of mind for almost everybody these days is tariffs. And there seems to be two definitions of the outcome of what tariffs will be doing, and depending upon whether money is going to end up in American bank accounts or who's paying the taxes, who's actually paying the tariffs. And it seems to me that either he just does not have an understanding of tariffs, but the president is saying that the country who is trying to export their goods will be paying that tariff to the U.S. Treasury, which most economists would suggest is erroneous. And I'm wondering why he continues to say that.
Yeah, I'm not an economist, but my understanding of tariffs is sort of in line with yours. Donald Trump has always said, right, you can go back to read The Art of the Deal, right? And his approach to a lot of public relations issues is to treat them just as public relations issues. And so the way that I see what he's doing here is that tariffs are complicated. They require some understanding. There's lots of actors involved and money flows in both directions. And it's just complicated enough that he can make a claim about who's going to pay the tariffs. And again, it goes back to this issue of polarization. So if you want to believe that this is going to be a good deal for you, you can, right? Because there's enough ambiguity, enough difficulty in understanding around what tariffs mean that we can say, no, I trust Donald Trump and his interpretation saying, like, you know, this is going to be expensive for the other side. My own sort of point of view is that probably everybody pays in one way or another, right? So even if the formal tariffs are being borne by the U.S. consumer, Canada pays in lots of other ways, right? Potentially increased unemployment. The weakening of the Canadian dollar means that it potentially costs more to sell our goods, whatever the case may be, right? In trade wars, everybody tends to lose.
Let's talk about executive orders. I had the impression that they weren't used all that frequently, but the day he was inaugurated, I saw this pile of executive order binders sitting on his desk, which seems to be a lot more than I've seen a president sign at any one time before. What's the role of these executive orders? Is it just to bypass Congress?
Not completely, right? They can be used for a lot of different purposes. So first I'll say it's actually not super unusual for there to be a raft of executive orders at the beginning of a presidency. And that's because executive orders are primarily instructions to bureaucratic agencies about how to implement the law. And so for any executive order, there is an authority through congressional statute. But congressional statutes can't cover everything, right? Even the longest ones, right? You think about Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act was something like 1,400 pages long when it was done. But even those, right, there's still lots of discretion, lots of things that can't be written into the law in order to implement these complex policies. And sometimes they're written in very specific ways, right? The Environmental Protection Agency should determine what level of mercury in water is considered toxic. Congress says, we're not experts in this. The EPA needs to decide what that means. But when it comes down to it, across a lot of these different areas, there's lots of discretion that agencies have in how they implement the law. And the buck stops with the president, right? He's at the top of the hierarchy of the executive branch and therefore has control, like has the ability to tell agencies how they should interpret these laws. And so in the most sort of favorable sense, that's what the Trump executive orders are doing, saying, here's what we think the law means, and that might be something different than what the Biden administration was telling you that the law means. Now, there are other things that can be done with executive orders. The executive order, for instance, trying to eliminate birthright citizenship, not necessarily based on any specific congressional statute, and seems to be on its face unconstitutional. So what's going on with that one? Can the president just rewrite the Constitution? And the answer is no, because what happened was what we would have expected to happen, is that immediately judges place injunctions on the enforcement of this provision. Temporary injunctions saying that we're going to get full briefing, but it appears that this is unconstitutional on its face. So why are they doing it? Well, some of it's red meat to the base to show that you're doing something right at the very beginning. But in that particular case, I also think that it's bait for the Supreme Court, right? We're creating a case so that we can appeal it up to the Supreme Court and get the Supreme Court to perhaps issue a decision saying, well, the various provisions of the Constitution that define birthright citizenship are more complex. There are some pretty fringe legal arguments, fringe conservative legal arguments that suggest that being subject to the jurisdiction of the United States may not apply to people who are undocumented. These are fringe. They're not considered mainstream legal arguments, but hey, this is not a particularly mainstream Supreme Court. So in some ways, they're taking their chances.
Is it the Supreme Court that decides if something is unconstitutional, ultimately?
At the end of the day, right? So like we can get into scholarly debates about this, but the simplest answer is yes, right? The Supreme Court says what the Constitution means, and the 14th Amendment birthright citizenship clause is subject to their interpretation.
One of the things I've heard as well is that, as he did last time, Trump decided to withdraw from international organizations. The one that I heard about lately was the WHO. He's withdrawing, and there's probably some plan to deal with NATO. Maybe he will withdraw or not. I'm not sure. Is this symptomatic of someone who wants to isolate the country?
Yeah, I think so. And I think he's been relatively open about that, right? A more popular part of his platform was moving away from wars in the Middle East, which I think there was an appetite across the spectrum for that. But going together with that is sort of a sense. Again, it's a bit of Trump has a way of getting into people's sort of the grieves that they have, right? And one thing that various people who support Donald Trump seem to think is that the United States is somehow getting a raw deal under these various, that the United States is being taken advantage of. And that's something that Donald Trump talks about a lot. And people often question, well, why does it seem like U.S. allies are getting rougher treatment than adversaries or other countries, right? And I think the answer is this sense that the United States is carrying countries like Canada. In the sense that, like the Paris Climate Agreement harms the U.S. more than it harms other countries. But yeah, it's certainly, I think on its face, it's fair to call it a kind of isolationism. The question becomes, why is this isolationism so attractive to so many Trump voters? And again, I think it sort of fits with that narrative that we were talking about earlier of why does it seem like things aren't as good for me as there's not as much promise in the United States for me as there was for my parents.
When you look at the White House as it is right now, every president who comes into office has a whole crew of advisors who are responsible for different aspects of the way the White House operates. And I know that there are a group who are responsible for maintaining a certain direction that they and the president think they should be going philosophically in terms of their map that they've got for the 4-year term. I'm trying to get a handle on how much influence are these folks, and if we use the descriptor of the Project 2025 people who wrote that book about what they see to be the direction the country should going. How much influence do they have over Trump, and how does he make decisions, or do you have a sense of that based upon your research?
I don't have a great sense of this. One thing that I noticed that's different in this administration versus the first Trump administration is that we don't so much see these competing power centers. Steve Bannon was brought in the first administration and seemed to sort of maintain his own office with people that were supportive of his kind of agenda and seemed to operate somewhat independently. It seems as though that sort of style of governance is out, and that Trump has been more selective about bringing in people who are operators on his behalf. In some cases, that means people who are like his chief of staff, who functioned as one of his a campaign manager during the campaign, are sort of like bureaucratic implementers of his agenda. And then there are people like Stephen Miller who have shown themselves to be sort of good lieutenants, but have interests that are aligned with Trump. Do I expect someone like Stephen Miller to have independent points of view and policy direction? Probably that's the case. But I do think that one of the ways that Trump as an administrator of the executive branch has likely changed is looking for people that are loyal to him in a personal way.
And is he coming up with the various plans that he wants to implement, or is he basically feeding off of these other folks who are his advisors?
Yeah, my sense is that Donald Trump is a pretty broad strokes guy, and I think that's what we've sort of all learned about him over the course of years. He has policies that he cares about, right? He certainly cares about tariffs. He cares about international agreements. He cares about immigration. But even he, I don't think, would claim to be a details guy. I'm sure he would claim that he knows all the details, but he's not necessarily the one that would claim to be in the weeds on all of that, right? So I think that in his mind, his ideal administration would be the one where he sets the top line policy and he has loyal lieutenants who fill in the details. I think that's probably the structure that he's trying to set up.
I know that you probably don't want to do this, but I'm going to ask you to do it anyway. And that's pull out your crystal ball and take us down the road 2 years or 4 years. And will we notice any major changes? Will things have calmed down? Will things have become more chaotic?
I think there are so many branching paths, right? I do think that we're sort of at a dangerous point, and we're seeing that Trump has been willing to take things further already in this presidency than he was in his previous presidency. The kinds of tariffs is an example, right? The kinds of tariffs that were implemented in Trump's first presidency were relatively targeted. They were smaller both in percentage terms, but especially in the kinds of goods targeted and the percentage of the economies of the affected countries that were relevant there. Right? These 25% across the board tariffs on Mexico and Canada represent something like a quarter of U.S. imports, and 25% is a huge number. So that's just a broad way of saying Trump has been willing to move further on some of these agenda items this time than he was in the past. And it also seems like he's more likely, for the reasons we were just talking about, to have people within the executive branch who are willing to implement his policies. Last time around, there was some resistance, right? He didn't always have cabinet secretaries or even chiefs of staff who agreed with his positions, and it limited the sorts of implementation of his policies that he could get because people just wouldn't do it, right? They would resign or they would slow walk those policies. And I think, again, through staffing, he's tried to avoid some of these things. I think it's really hard to know what things could get really out of control, right? We've talked about, he's talked about the way he's going to resolve the war between Russia and Ukraine. Certainly, there are certain resolutions to that could upend the way that international politics has been understood since the end of World War II. Various immigration policies could be more extreme than the last time around, although there are more limitations on that because the Supreme Court has spoken on certain things, right, like Muslim bans and whatnot, saying that there are limitations on what Trump can actually do.
Interestingly enough, as I was waiting to sit down and chat with you, I was flipping through the news feed, and the tariffs on Mexico have been paused because the president of Mexico said she was going to send 10,000 troops to the border to slow down the immigration process. So Trump has backed off on that for the next month or so. And then when you talk about Ukraine and Russia, he's talking about making it a deal that if Ukraine gives the U.S. their rare minerals or rare stones, whatever they call these things that everybody needs, that he will continue to provide U.S. support. So it's this deal business that you've talked about based upon the kind of person he is, and that's what he's always done, is try to, put together some sort of deal.
And yeah, I think that, in its most ideal sense, and I wouldn't make the claim that it's always worked, but the post-World War II order is based on, ideals, right, that we would want to aspire to, like self-determination and justice, right? International organizations are supposed to be promoting cooperation and more fairness around the world. Reducing all of this to sort of deal-making, I think, devalues some of that. And let's be real, there are lots of people who would say, it's always been about deals. But deals in the context of certain principles function differently than just raw interest, right? The concerns that I have are around saying, well, if you start a war of aggression and you get sort of locked in, you dig in, and so it seems like neither side can really advance any further. Well, you might just gain something because you might get to keep some of the territory that you gained aggressively. That seems impossible to imagine, right? I don't know how you square that with how international politics has been done over the past 75 years. It would be a huge change, but it's also not inconsistent with, Trump's aggressive stance towards Greenland or something, right? As ridiculous as it seems, and part of my reaction to something like Greenland is just to treat it like sort of the laugh that it should be. But we can see the Prime Minister of Denmark treating it very seriously because I think a lot of people have been burned by treating Donald Trump as a joke in the past.
Circle back to the comments we were discussing earlier about the loyalty factor that Trump has over the MAGA group or the members of his administration or the Senate or the House, whatever. Who's the heir apparent? Does this continue after Trump? Or is it his cult of personality that is holding everything together?
Well, so yes to that last part, right? Like it absolutely is about Trump to some degree, but there will be people that try to play off that. I mean, right now, the person who's in the best position is probably J.D. Vance, right? Like Trump, in some ways, has set him up as the heir apparent by making him vice president. And this is a guy who, by all accounts, is pretty smart, but also is willing to follow the lead of Trump and sort of work the politics in such a way that's going to put him on a better footing. But all we have to do is sort of look to any number of actors in the first Trump administration, Steve Bannon, Mike Pence, right? These people seem like they're in the good graces of Trump and Trump world until they're not. So I think it's really, it's hard to, again, get into the crystal ball and figure out where this is going to go. But there are certainly people out there trying to position themselves as next in line, right? Somebody like Ron DeSantis would also love to sort of throw his hat into the ring. And we see people that were at one time harshly critical of Donald Trump that now, are his Secretary of State, like in Marco Rubio. So what do these people do if they ever got the Republican nomination? Do they sort of continue down that road, or do they try to pull the Republican Party back in another direction? I don't know. But yeah, it seems hard to figure out what the Republican Party now would look like without Trump.
For those of us who live outside the U.S., how should we be looking at all of this? Should we be getting really concerned, or should we let things play out a little bit over the next little while? It's only been 2 weeks.
Yeah, I mean, that's something that I sort of struggle with an answer to as well. As an American citizen living in Canada, I can vote, right? But there isn't a ton that we can do, right, to affect U.S. politics directly. We sort of suffer from that we have to watch and wait, and hope that our political leaders respond in forceful and appropriate ways. I guess that's the one thing that we as Canadians can pay attention to, is trying to think about what we want our leaders to do. What that is, I mean, I'm open to hearing proposals as much as anybody else.
A lot to unpack here. Like I said at the beginning of this show, I want to thank you very much for sharing your expertise with us. And I'm sure that in a couple of years, we might want to get back together and see what's happened and see how things have evolved.
Yeah, we can look and see if that crystal ball we were looking at was any good.
Thanks again for your time.
Thanks for having me.
Hope you found this discussion helpful. Please take a moment to leave a comment. My guest in this episode was Paul Gardner, Assistant Professor of Political Studies at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario. To those of you who have taken the time to listen, thank you. I'll be back soon with another conversation.
The theme music for the podcast is Stasis Oasis, written and performed by Kingston musician Tim Aylesworth. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions about any of the episodes, please send a note to thekingstonianpodcast@gmail.com. For details on upcoming guests, follow us on Facebook. The Kingstonian Podcast is hosted by Dave Cunningham and produced in Kingston, Ontario, Canada.